So I found another Robert Reich video that's full of shaky, illogical assumptions and disinformation about labor unions and their effects on the economy. The video is produced by MoveOn.org, and it looks pretty slick. Production quality is pretty good. But don't let that fool you. This video is full of widely discredited fallacies. So join me as we break it down.
We must strengthen labor unions. Here's why, and here's how. We need stronger unions. 50 years ago, workers joined together to get a bigger share of the economy's gains. Unions not only raised wages, but also improved working conditions for everyone. Pressed for legal protections, like the 40-hour work week and worker safety, and thereby strengthened the economy overall.
Robert Reich would lead you to believe that all gains made by workers in important metrics such as compensation and working conditions could not have been achieved without labor unions. Apparently, Reich isn't much of a historian. What he fails to tell you is that well before the somewhat vague time window he references, even as far back as the 19th century, American workers across the board have been continuously gaining in compensation and have enjoyed consistently improving working conditions. Between the years 1800 and 1900, real wages and living standards for all American workers grew fantastically. Per capita GDP grew at least 4 times the amount by the year 1900 that it was in the year 1800. And what would you guess the percentage of unionized American workers was at the turn of the 20th century? Was it 30%? 50%? 70%? Try 3%. So how did a workforce that was 97% non-unionized gain so much? Reich should really explain the reasons for the explosive economic growth that the United States experienced during the 19th and well into the early 20th century, when labor unions were an extreme minority. Labor unions simply cannot claim credit for trends that began well before they gained any significant share of the working population. It's worth noting that American unionism, at its absolute height in the 1950s, still only reached about 1 out of 3 workers. And the 40-hour work week? That was instituted by Henry Ford in 1926 to his non-unionized factory workers. The UAW wasn't even founded until 1935 and did not sign its first contract with Ford Motor Company until 1941.
In the big picture, as union membership has weakened from more than 1/3 of all private sector workers belonging to unions in the 1950s to fewer than 7% today, that decline has mirrored almost exactly the decline of the middle class.
So here Reich is leaving out some important information. What he wants you to assume is that workers leaving the middle class are falling into the lower classes. The reality can be seen here in this chart that measures percent shares of U.S. households by income level from 1967 to 2013. This maroon line at the top shows the decline of middle-class households. No argument there. You can see that middle-class households did in fact diminish from 53% to 43%. The blue line here shows the share of lower-income households also dropping from 39% to 34%. Now, if there are less households classified as being both middle and lower class in 2013 than there were in 1967, what do you suppose happened? Well, what happened is that during this time period, the amount of higher-income households has increased. The red line shows that households bringing in $100,000 or more grew from just 7% of the total in 1967 up to 22% in 2013. So the middle class is only shrinking because people are actually migrating into higher income classes, not lower. But this little tidbit of information wouldn't support his narrative, now would it?
Years ago, unions were the great countervailing power to business. Strong unions mean a strong middle class, which means a strong economy.
Saying that unions are a counterbalance to businesses is typical of the leftist need to always create a conflict between two groups where one doesn't necessarily exist. The real counterbalance that workers have when negotiating pay and benefits is the existence of other employment options. And saying that strong unions means a strong middle class, and in turn a strong economy, is assuming that demand-side economics works. It doesn't. Capital investment is clearly what drives the economy. I've explained this in detail in another video, which I'll link to at the end.
So how do we strengthen unions? First, make it easier to form a union, with a simple majority of workers voting up or down. Right now, long delays and procedural hurdles give big employers plenty of time to whip up campaigns against unions.
So Reich wants union-seeking workers to be able to blitzkrieg their employers and fellow workers who may be on the fence about unionization by rushing through a certification election? Should employers not have a right to ample time to explain to their own workers the very real reasons why forming a labor union could be detrimental to their firm? Reich won't tell you any of this, but employers are already hampered by somewhat Orwellian and subjectively interpreted labor rules known as unfair labor practices that labor unions use to keep employers from portraying labor unionization in a negative light to their workers. The NLRB already has its thumb on the scale for labor unions. Reich wants them now to drop an elbow on it.
Second, build in real penalties on companies that violate labor laws by firing workers who try to organize a union. Nowadays, the worst that can happen is employers have to repay lost wages to the workers they fire.
Any employer reserves the right to terminate any employee for any reason outside the constraints of a voluntary and mutually agreed upon labor contract. I'll explain more about freedom of association here shortly.
Finally, and this has been in the news a lot lately, if you remember only one thing, remember this: we must enact a federal law that overturns so-called state right-to-work laws. And don't be fooled by the name. It's a backdoor to destroying unions. If no one pays dues, unions have no resources to organize. And that means lower wages and the loss of other worker protections.
The state laws Reich wants the federal government to strike down give the worker the freedom to choose whether or not he or she wants to join or pay dues to the union. Do I agree that workers should have those freedoms? Yes. However, there is an issue with today's right-to-work laws that shouldn't be overlooked. While these laws do not outlaw or forbid labor unions, they do forbid business owners from voluntarily setting up contracts with labor unions to require their employees to join the union. If a business owner decides that he wants all his workers to join a union as a condition of employment, the law should protect his right to do so. It's his business. The aspect of today's unionism I find troubling is that labor unions are able to use the forces of government to bypass the wills of the business owner and employees by compelling them to join or pay tribute to the union as a condition of employment. Labor unions have no such right. It's not their business. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. Despite this, it's clear that if labor unions are diminished further as a result of right-to-work legislation, it will be primarily because of voluntary choices and preferences of workers, not because unions have been forcibly outlawed. Reich then goes on to say that under right-to-work, that nobody will pay dues and the unions will have no money. Well, he's begging the question here, isn't he? Why does he think that employees, if given the choice, will abandon the labor union? Maybe the reason unions won't have as much money is because many workers, very capable of making their own decisions, will decide that they don't see the union as a benefit. He then alludes to lower wages, which we'll get to in a moment.
In fact, wages in right-to-work states are lower than wages in non-right-to-work states by an average of about $6,000 a year. Workers in right-to-work states are also less likely to have employer-sponsored health insurance and pension coverage. And the lowering tide pulls down all the boats. All workers in states with right-to-work laws, those in unions or not, are worse off.
He's right that the wages of workers in right-to-work states are numerically lower than in forced union states. But that's not telling the whole story. The rest of the story is that when cost of living adjustments are made for these regions, the purchasing power of workers in right-to-work states are the same or in some cases even greater than workers in forced union states. Again, that doesn't support Reich's narrative, so it's not included in this video.
American workers need a union to bargain on their behalf.
No, They don't.
Including low-wage workers in big-box retail stores and fast food chains. If we want working Americans to get a fair share of the gains from economic growth, they must be able to unionize.
Well, despite flaws in the legislation, right to work doesn't prevent workers from unionizing. It simply allows those who want union representation to join a union and have it. And for those who don't want union representation, to bargain for themselves.